Welcome to the Sanity podcast by the New York Sun. My name is A.R. Hoffman, and every week my co-host Rebecca Sugar and I speak to the people that you want to hear from. Our guest this week is Yardena Schwartz. Yardena is an award-winning journalist and Emmy-nominated producer who's worked across print and television. She's written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, The Economist, the New York Review of Books, mostly about Israel and the stories of that place. She lived there for 10 years, and she has an extraordinary new book out called Ghosts of a Holy War, the 1929 Massacre in Palestine that ignited the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's out from Union Square & Co. Books, and is available everywhere books are sold. Yardena, can you just start off by telling us a little bit how you came to write about the Hebron massacres and why you think they matter today?
So first of all, great to be here. Thanks so much for having me. This book really found me, actually. I was living in Tel Aviv at the time, working as a freelance journalist, and I was introduced to a family in Memphis, Tennessee, that had discovered a box of letters in their attic. And those letters were written by their great uncle, David Schoenberg, in the late 1920s. He had moved from Memphis to the holy city of Hebron, which was in British Mandate Palestine at the time. And the letters...
The classic Memphis Hebron.
Yes, exactly. Classic. And over the course of David's year in Hebron, learning at what was then the most prestigious yeshiva in the land of Israel, in British Mandate Palestine, he wrote these vivid, beautiful letters to his family.
The yeshiva, just for our listeners, is a Jewish seminary of advanced study.
Exactly. Yeah. So he wrote to his family every week these very long letters. So this box was filled with hundreds of pages of his letters. And what was so fascinating to the family and to me when I had a chance to read these letters in 2019 for the first time was that it painted this vivid portrait of a Hebron that has ceased to exist because Hebron is a very holy city to both Jews and Muslims. And at the time that David was living there, it was a place where Jews and Muslims lived in peace side by side. Fast forward to today, and Hebron is a microcosm of the conflict. It's the antithesis of coexistence. When he was living there, it was a beacon of coexistence. So I was really fascinated by that transformation and how that transformation had taken place. And David was part of that transformation because he was murdered in a massacre in 1929 that really set the stage for this conflict. And so I used his letters as a jumping off point to investigate, why that massacre had occurred and the forces that it had ignited over the course of the last century.
Amazing. Almost like a cold case or a detective story. Why don't you take us back? What was the state of play in 1929? Who was in charge? What was the political dynamics? One of the things that struck me about your book was you say that this, on the one hand, was a time so unlike our own. On the other hand, I think you argue convincingly and compellingly that it is the key to understanding our own moment.
Absolutely. So in 1929, Palestine was controlled by the British Mandate. It was essentially a British territory. It wasn't a state. It wasn't really a country even before the British took over Palestine. That happened after World War I with the fall of the Ottoman Empire, which had ruled over the province of Palestine for more than 400 years. Before the Ottomans, it had been ruled by a rotating cast of foreign powers. And the British had essentially promised independence to both the Arabs of Palestine and the Jews of Palestine. Palestine at the time was home to a Jewish minority. About 20% of the population of Palestine at the time was Jewish, but there were certain cities with a Jewish majority. Jerusalem, for example, had been a majority Jewish city for decades. But under the Ottoman Empire, before the British took over, Jews were second-class citizens, essentially. They had different rights than the majority Muslim population. In Hebron, for example, they were forbidden from entering their holiest place. Hebron is holy to both Jews and Muslims because it is the burial place of Abraham, who's considered the father of the Jewish people. In Islam, he's considered a prophet. And so under Muslim rule, Jews had been forbidden from entering the tomb of the patriarchs, which is the burial place of Abraham and the patriarchs and matriarchs of the Jewish people. And the massacre it wasn't just in Hebron. It was actually part of these week-long riots that gripped all of Palestine as a result of incitement, and fear-mongering, and disinformation spread by Muslim leaders at the time.
Can I just pick up on, you mentioned that Jews and Muslims were living in peace side by side in Hebron, which is true. But it also struck me that you did talk about in the book that, that woman who couldn't go up the seventh step into the tomb because she was so trained as a Jew, she was not allowed into one of the Jewish people's holiest sites by her Muslim peaceful neighbors. So I wonder if we have to rethink. One of the things I took away from reading this book was, what does it mean to live in peace side by side with your Muslim neighbors in Israel? It's a very loose peace. And even in the best of times, there was real discrimination. And it struck me, as we're drawing parallels between then and now, in many ways, you could have argued the same things about what was happening on the ground on October 7th, is a loose peace. It wasn't, people hanging out together and living next door to each other in peace and harmony. What do you make of this idea of Jews living together side by side in peace with their Muslim neighbors? Is that a reality? Is that something we can achieve?
It's a really great and important question. I don't know what the future might hold. I don't think any of us can, especially in regards to the potential impact of October 7th, both on Israelis and Jews and on Muslims and Palestinians. Surely we won't know until this war ends. But in 1929, if we can draw any kind of lessons from it, happened before the massacre, is that the Jewish leaders in Hebron had been warned by the Haganah, the underground Jewish defense force that would later become the nucleus of the Israel Defense Forces. At the time, they were this very loosely organized, very underarmed defense force, and they had come from Jerusalem to Hebron to warn the Jewish leaders of Hebron that there were going to be riots and that they wanted to defend them, because they knew the Jews in Hebron were these pious, religious Jews who lived a quiet existence centered around the Torah. None of them were armed. They would not be able to defend themselves. So the Haganah wanted to either bring armed men there to defend them or evacuate them to Jerusalem until the riots subsided. And the Jewish leaders of Hebron were unanimous in their opposition. Not only did they say that armed men here would only provoke our Muslim neighbors who are our friends, but if anything happens in Hebron, they believed that their friends and neighbors would protect them, that they would never hurt them, that if anything, if people from outside of Hebron came to hurt the Jews there, that their Arab neighbors would protect them.
Right. Because of prior incidents in Israel, right?
Exactly.
Hebron had been exempted really from the violence.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And I love that piece in the book where you talk about the sort of warm relations that obtained between Arabs and Jews. I mean, you talk about them drinking Turkish coffee together, smoking hookah. It's heartbreaking, playing backgammon, that kind of thing.
Going to each other's weddings, holidays together. And it was to the point where up until the very moment when the riots actually did reach Hebron, and not only from people who came in from outside of Hebron, but from the people of Hebron themselves. It was 3,000 Muslim men out of 20,000 total Arabs in that city who participated in the massacre. And when it began, the Jews in Hebron still trusted that their friends would protect them. And one of the leaders who had rejected the offers of help from the Haganah, his friends had actually come to his house that morning and sat outside his house. 70 people had taken refuge in this young man's house because they knew he had such good relations with leaders of the Arab community. But by the time the riots came, the mobs came to his house, those friends were gone. And at least one of them was actually among the rioters in his home. And they ended up killing him and his wife. But, it's really haunting to think how effective and how dangerously successful campaigns of propaganda and disinformation are, because these communities really did have such beautiful relations together before the massacre. And I think it's really informative to show us how we should not take lightly disinformation. And, we often, or maybe not we, but other people dismiss as peaceful certain protests where, vile, hateful language is being used. And they say, okay, but violence, actual physical violence wasn't, being used. Okay, how long do we have to wait for violent words to turn into violent actions?
But I want to push you on this a little because it's uncomfortable to even think about. But it was my thought, if I just read through this book, I might take away the conclusion might be maybe that peace and harmony is in our hopes and dreams, but it never really was in reality. And maybe it was nice to have Turkish coffee with their neighbors in 1929, but maybe that isn't what peace really is. And do we keep getting reminders that that we have the appearance of peace, but not actual peace? And it's a depressing thing to say. And I'm not advocating it. I'm just sort of pointing out that it strikes me that that's one of the great parallels and a sad one.
Yeah, I mean, one thing just to jump off on that, Rebecca, is, lots of studies of genocide has shown that often it is neighbors, right? There's a famous Rwanda example. It was actually people who knew each other very well. And the Holocaust, needless to say, not entirely, of course, there was industrial and mass killing, but there was also a lot of very intimate, very local killings, especially on the Eastern Front. So it just goes to this question of sort of, does the massacre of 1929, and I think there were 67 Jews slaughtered in Hebron, more in the rest of the land of Israel. I guess what I hear you saying, Rebecca, does that invalidate what came before? Or sort of in the way, does October 7th retroactively
do we need to learn a different lesson, which is, to rethink what we think about when we think about living in peace side by side with other people? Is that an attainable goal in the way we all hope it is? Not to put a damper on the conversation, but what did you make of that?
I mean, I definitely agree that Jews in Hebron were not treated equally, and they were absolutely treated as a weak minority. I mean, they were 800 Jews living among 20,000 Muslims. They were sometimes cursed at and spat on, even if they were praying outside of the Tomb of the Patriarchs. They are seen as inferior. Nevertheless, that is different from being, a place where violence is a trait of a daily life in Hebron, which is the case today. I mean, Hebron is one of the sites of, the most frequent terrorist attacks. Many of the terror attacks that are carried out in Israel or other parts of the West Bank emanate from Hebron. So I'm not saying that everything was perfect in Hebron before 1929, but the relationships between Jews and Muslims were much more friendly. I mean, you can't even compare. Like, to imagine Muslims in Hebron attending their Jewish neighbors' weddings now is unthinkable. Yet I want to push back at this idea that Muslims and Jews can't live together side by side, because that's not true. I mean, Muslims and Jews did live together side by side throughout history, not only in Palestine or the land of Israel, but also throughout the Arab world. I mean, before the 1970s and even, in the 1940s, before that, there were millions of Jews living in the Muslim world and living very prosperous. It didn't end well, but that was a result of disinformation by their leaders. What I argue is that, without this disinformation and this, unchallenged disinformation, because there's always going to be efforts to disinform and to stoke fear in a population by corrupt leaders. We don't just see that obviously in the Arab world; we see it from our own politicians. But when those disinformation campaigns aren't challenged and aren't countered with information and facts, then it's going to convince peaceful people to turn on their neighbors, and that's exactly what we saw in 1929. It's also what happened in the Arab world when Jewish communities were violently expelled because of that disinformation. And in 1929, what that disinformation looked like is something that continues to drive the conflict today, yet began in the year preceding the riots. And it was exactly what spawned the riots. And that was this lie that was launched by the leader of Palestinian Muslims under British rule, the Grand Mufti, Haj Amin al-Husseini, who began to convince his people that the Jews of Palestine were planning to destroy Al-Aqsa Mosque in order to rebuild their ancient...
I've heard that one before.
Yeah, I mean, Al-Aqsa flood, does that ring a bell? I mean, it's no coincidence why Hamas named its attack on October 7th the Al-Aqsa flood, because that lie has continued to galvanize support for various armed groups, terrorist groups, and even just political factions within Palestinian society, despite the fact that today Al-Aqsa Mosque is essentially, it's on land controlled by Israel. If Israel truly did want to conquer Al-Aqsa Mosque to rebuild the ancient Jewish temple in Jerusalem, it could have done so long ago and hasn't. And yet that lie remains one of the driving forces of this conflict. Mm-hmm.
I remember growing up and learning about the massacre, and I was just trying in advance of this conversation to remember what I'd learned. And I think I remember seeing the grainy pictures, of the victims, and I think the overall sort of lesson of it was always kind of a pessimistic one, sort of on the line of what Rebecca was saying, was, even before the state, even before the occupation, even before whatever settlers, there's this kind of seed of religious hatred, right? And the lesson is sort of like, well, what can you do? You know what I mean? Like you couldn't win, right? And it's almost seen as in the line of pogroms that date back to Kishinev and sort of the European example of sort of the helpless Jew being massacred, and then that sort of led into the Holocaust, and that's sort of the frame. I want to get your reaction to that, but also, your title of your book is Holy War. You're interested in this religious dimension to the conflict that I think people are very hesitant now to talk about. They talk about in terms of land or politics or compromise or territory, but I just, that seems to me a major contribution is your interest in the religious dimension and how you see it dating to the Hebron massacres and playing out today.
Well, I think it's interesting and really mind-boggling how so many international organizations and leaders fail to see the religious element of this conflict, because it truly is at the very basic level a holy war, and it has always been a holy war. And I think that this massacre 2 decades before the State of Israel was born really illuminates that fact, because as you said, I mean, there was no state of Israel in 1929. The Jews were 20% of a population of less than 1 million people. It was the British who ruled the land. And, what we heard from the Muslim leaders and Arab leaders in Palestine then, and what we continue to hear from Palestinian leaders today, including Hamas, and not only Hamas, is that there is no legitimacy to a Jewish presence in the land of Israel. There's a complete rejection of Jewish history in the land of Israel. When I spoke to Palestinians, not only in Hebron, but in other parts of the West Bank, they believe that the history of the Jewish people in the land of Israel is a lie, and that any archaeological evidence of an ancient kingdom of Israel is Zionist propaganda. And I think it's really telling that we're now today hearing that same dismissal, that same rejection of Jewish history in the land of Israel, not from Palestinians, but from white, wealthy students at elite universities. And I think that is a symptom of the fact that the religious nature of this conflict has been ignored, and the very statements of members of Hamas have been ignored. I mean, how often do we see in news stories these statements by Hamas saying openly that they want to rid the Jews from this land, that Palestine is a holy Muslim land and always needs to be holy Muslim land. This idea that, we hear from liberal Western supporters of Hamas that they want to turn Israel not into an Islamist state, but into this, utopian society where all religions are respected, and they ignore the very nature of Hamas and others like them, which respect no pluralism, even within Islam, regardless of Jews.
I think part of the reluctance to name it as a religious war is it becomes kind of hopeless, right? I mean, if there's no possibility of compromise, there's no possibility of a treaty of some sort. You have sort of what you have in Gaza right now. I mean, Hamas doesn't have territorial demands, really. It's just everything or nothing. And I think by surfacing the riots, you kind of give a productive history of that, right? To say that this was something there from the beginning, these kind of existential stakes.
It also strikes me that the religious piece exists on the Jewish side too, in the sense that, right, this was centered around a big yeshiva. It still is, in effect, today. A place where people pray and go to a Jewish school to study. And a lot of the debate, I remember being in Israel at a time in a car with my cousin. I remember this conversation when Israel was sort of dealing with Hebron at that time and what to do with it. And I think it was Netanyahu. It was Netanyahu,
right, who signed the treaty that handed over 80% of Hebron to the Palestinian Authority.
So I remember being in a car with my cousin, who's a secular Israeli from Tel Aviv, and I was very upset about losing our ancient homeland, and this is our land, and such an important tract of land. And in the Bible, it was purchased. I mean, all the reasons why, as from a Jewish perspective, this was so important. And she looked at me as a secular Israeli mother of soldiers and said, well, your child is not going to be one of, 100 or 1,000 soldiers posted there trying to save a few hundred people from tens of thousands who surround them who hate them. So, it was an interesting argument. There was also a secular religious debate in Israel about what is this piece of land worth to Jews? And Jews who are religious and secular have different answers to that question. And so when you look at Hebron today and you think of it in terms of that religious question, what do you have to, what are your reflections on that issue?
And just to build on that, I mean, Hebron, that's another dimension of the story is for really everyone, but I think the religious right or just the right, like Hebron's really been disowned by secular Israel, or they see it as the emblematic of the worst, right? Of kind of
liability.
Like as a liability, as kind of almost like just they're embarrassed of the state of affairs in Hebron. Right?
Absolutely. I think it has become the poster child for the ugly settler, for the violent settler, the violent element of the settler movement. I think most Israelis are aware that the violent extremist settlers are not the majority of settlers, that, a small percentage of them are violent. But the fact that the government does virtually nothing to hold those violent settlers accountable paints a very dire picture of the rest of the settlement movement. It paints them as all being violent and paints the government as being culpable, which it is essentially if they're not going to hold people accountable for their violence. But what's interesting is that despite that kind of distancing of secular Israelis from Hebron, many of them have either never been to Hebron. When I was reporting from Hebron for my book, so many Israelis were shocked that I was even going to Hebron. They thought I couldn't go there. They thought Israelis weren't allowed to go to Hebron.
My friends in Tel Aviv would have been less surprised if I said I was going to the moon. Truly. And it's 45 minutes away.
Yeah, you can drive there.
It was inconceivable that someone would go.
Maybe more Israelis have been to Jordan than Hebron.
Probably. If they're secular, And yet, if you ask most secular Israelis, and maybe I'm imagining if you asked them 2 years ago before October 7th, if there's a two-state solution, would Hebron remain part of Israel? And the vast majority of Israelis believe it should be part of Israel because at the end of the day, if Jews can't live in Hebron, I mean, the cradle of the Jewish people where our patriarchs and matriarchs are buried, why should Jews be able to live in Haifa or in Jaffa or in Jerusalem? I mean, the kingdom of Israel was first established in Hebron. King David, the first capital was in Hebron, not in Jerusalem. So I think that's just another kind of a really stark contrast in Hebron itself. And, there have been left-wing politicians in Israel. I mean, not left-wing, center-left, such as Yair Lapid. President Herzog has said, in any future peace treaty with the Palestinians, Hebron would remain part of Israel. The question is, what kind of Hebron? I think it's the Hebron today is not sustainable, and it's only gotten worse since October 7th. But what I try to illuminate in the book is that it doesn't have to be this way. We shouldn't be hopeless. First of all, the restrictive measures that have been taken in Hebron and elsewhere, certain restrictions of movement on Palestinians who live in Hebron, or things like the security barrier that runs through the West Bank. These measures have been put in place, sadly, for very necessary reasons as a response to terrorist attacks. And I think anyone who tries to look at these measures without including the context within which they exist and the reasons they were put into place is never going to arrive at a solution. And I think that that's one of the reasons the religious aspect of the conflict has also been ignored. And I agree with you. There's definitely a Jewish element of that religious nature, of course. I mean, the whole issue of Israel itself is a religious concept. And yet, why do secular Israelis who don't believe in God and who aren't religious also believe in the right of Jews to live in Israel, not necessarily for religious reasons, but for historic reasons? This is our indigenous homeland. I mean, the DNA of Jews goes back to the land of Israel. All of our holidays are based around the land of Israel. I mean, you cannot deny the connection between Jews and Israel. But what I think is really terrifying about the what is happening on both sides in terms of that religious aspect is that the lies that have been told about these Israeli plans and plots to destroy Al-Aqsa and rebuild the ancient temple, they're being exacerbated by certain people within the Israeli government who are giving voice to those fears. I mean, when people like National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir declare that there is no more status quo on the Temple Mount, and declare that Jews can pray on the Temple Mount, contrary to the status quo on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, which was put in place because of these fears, because of these lies perpetuated by Palestinian leaders for the last century that Jews are planning to destroy Al-Aqsa. They work into, he's playing into the hands of
Lighter
actors
fluid.
like Hamas.
Yeah. I mean, I think some of the most powerful things about your book is that you refute this history of erasure, right? And you say that to understand Hebron, and this is so much of, the sort of white leftist intellectual parachute into Hebron. They'll see the street closed. They'll see ugly sights. They'll see unsettling sights, and that's it, right? And you kind of tell a richer, broader story. I'm curious about like the legacy of sort of violence that has attached to Hebron. There's the 1929 massacre. There was the shooting of that baby girl, Israeli girl, I forget her name.
Shalhevet Pas.
During
and then, of course, during the Al-Aqsa Intifada.
Intifada.
And then,
and we can't not talk about the Baruch Goldstein massacre as well. And so I'm just curious about this legacy of violence, and sort of oftentimes the 1929 massacre is sort of put in this dialogue with the Baruch Goldstein massacre at the mine, and the result is kind of this just blood-soaked intractability or something. I mean, did you think about that in telling the story? Or
so actually, I started writing my book in 2019, and before October 7th, it was going to look a lot different than the way it looks today. After October 7th, of course, the book became a very different book, and kind of tracing the parallels between the massacre of 1929 and the massacre of October 7th, and illuminating just, how we got to this point and how we can find a way out of it. But before October 7th, I was planning for the book to be much more focused on Hebron itself and that transformation and that evolution from 1929 with the massacre of Jews in Hebron to 1994 with a massacre of Palestinians by a Jewish extremist. And I still have, elements of that in the book. I go into great detail about Baruch Goldstein's massacre in 1994. And when, it really shows these two massacres. When you speak to Jews and Muslims in Hebron, you see how formative each of these massacres are in their ideology. So when I would talk to Palestinians and ask them about the massacre of 1929, they always thought I was confused. They would say, oh, you mean the massacre of 1994? They didn't know about the massacre of 1929 if they were under a certain age. If they were over a certain age, they knew about the massacre, but they twisted the facts of the massacre. They either said it was committed by the British, not by the Arabs. Some of them blamed the Jews for the massacre of 1929, echoing the lies that were spread by Arab leaders back then. But among Jews, I often heard a similarly disturbing effort to justify Baruch Goldstein's massacre. So sometimes they would say, you know, I disagree with killing innocents, but you have to understand, Baruch had seen so many people being killed during, you know, the suicide bombings, and he was a paramedic, so he would go to the scenes of these terrorist attacks. And you can't ignore the fact that when you go to his burial place, which is not in Hebron, it's right outside of Hebron in Kiryat Arba, in the settlement where he lived, there are stones on his grave in respect to him, and the message on his tombstone is one of reverence and gratitude. And there are people in Hebron who didn't beat around the bush, who didn't pretend that they disagreed with him. They were openly calling him to my face a hero, saying he prevented another massacre of Jews, as if killing innocent Muslims is going to prevent other Muslims from wanting to carry out a revenge attack. I mean, there is this, on both sides, this failure to see how violence begets violence, how extremism begets extremism. And sadly, we're seeing that continue to play out today.
I wanted to talk about one of the, I guess, recommendations or sort of optimistic thoughts you had towards the end of the book about, you know, the way out of this. And I'm going to push back again here, just because I'm not so sure that I see a way out, but maybe you can persuade me that there is one. That would be a happy ending. You talked about that, the way out being raising the sort of moderate voices on both sides and giving them a chance to speak so that the extremists don't dominate the conversation, which in theory sounds exactly right to me, nothing to disagree with there. However, we had Oslo for 20-something years. It feels like there was this decades-long attempt to find moderate voices and to raise them and to get them to the table, and it failed over and over again. And many would say because there aren't that enough moderate partners to work with to create the peace that we're all wanting. So is that the way out? Is more dialogue what's needed? Is more moderates what's needed? Haven't we tried that already? And I hate to sound like I'm such a downer, but sometimes populations separate. And again, I'm not advocating one position or the other. I'm just asking the question. One could read this book with the optimism that you have, and one could read this book and say, you know what, maybe separation is the answer, a la, you know, Pakistan and India, which doesn't work out. Yeah. They're not doing too well these days.
It's complicated though, right, Rebecca? Because like a separation, I was totally with you. And then, you know, the news obviously in the last few days is that Israel is thinking about a full-scale reoccupation of Gaza. So this question of kind of how these territories, how these two people live together, who's where, you know.
Well, that's the Trump, you know, Gaza land, but whatever idea.
It looks like the Israeli population has decided that, you know, that these are risks that can no longer be taken.
I'm more asking this not as for you to offer us like a political policy point, but to sort of, in theory, to sort of say, is the prescription always just more dialogue, and doesn't that seem like something we've tried and hasn't worked? And what's new? What's the new solution here that's different this time?
So actually, the only new solution is empowering the moderates and the peace-seeking voices, because that hasn't actually been tried. What has been tried is forcing, and not just tried, what has been done for decades now is just forcing both sides to the table. I mean, Oslo, that wasn't a deal between moderates. That was just a deal between the existing leaders. Right. So, you know, recognizing the PLO. Yeah.
In your book, I think you mentioned that Yasser Arafat was the Mufti's cousin.
Yes. Right. So he was his disciple.
Right. So not exactly a partner in peace.
No, of course not. Yeah. That was not a case of working with a peace-seeking moderate. Arafat was anything but a peace-seeking moderate. And what Israel has failed to do over many years, and what the international community I hate that word, but I mean, for lack of a better word, the international community, the U.S. administration, European leaders, obviously the UN, though I have no hope left for the UN whatsoever. But what has not been tried is empowering actual peace-seeking Palestinians who reject the use of violence, who do favor a two-state solution. Those people fear for their lives because they are often assassinated or harassed, intimidated, forced to flee their land. There's a reason why many of the most outspoken voices against Hamas don't live in the West Bank or Gaza. They live in, they've achieved amnesty. They've received amnesty, in the U.S. or in Europe. And so long as that's the case, we're never going to have different kind of leaders within Palestinian society who are going to embrace an actual real peace, and rather than just use these treaties to build up their own power, as they did with Oslo, and fail to actually combat terrorism.
Would you give us like a way? I mean, meaning the reason they are not in the West Bank or in Gaza is because they can't be, and they can't exercise power, they'll be killed. So how do we get to a place?
Uplift their voices, give them more legitimacy, work with them. There was, I think, an opportunity after October 7th to try to have regime change in Gaza. I think that's what a lot of Israelis anticipated, because they recognize that if you're going to defeat Hamas, you can't defeat Hamas when there's no alternative government in Gaza. And that's what so many Israeli security officials have said, that, the military effort has to be alongside some kind of political effort to replace Hamas. And, what we could have seen is an empowering of, the very activists who are leading the protests against Hamas, risking their own lives to do so. They're doing so alone. They're not having the support of, international leaders and activists and peace activists. And I think that has been a real mistake in peace efforts. And, you mentioned the idea of separation. That's what the two-state solution is. And I still believe that the two-state solution is the only solution. I'm not saying it can happen today, tomorrow, maybe not even 5 or 10 years. It's going to take time. But I don't think that either the Israeli people or the Palestinian people will ever have a better future if only one of those sides has self-determination. I think in the same light that we recognize that Jews and Israelis need self-determination, I think the Palestinians also deserve self-determination, but they can only achieve that self-determination if they have the kind of leadership that wants a peaceful future and not just the destruction of Israel.
I was itching to ask you something. Just a quick question. Who can you give us names? Who would lead that effort? Who would run that state? Who would be the leader that you would have liked to have seen take over for Hamas? Is there actually a person, or is it just the idea of a type of person?
So there are various Palestinian peace activists. Some of them are living in the West Bank. Some are in Gaza. Some are in the U.S. and in Europe. Hamza Hawadi is one name. He's based in Germany, but he was until very recently living in Gaza. He fled for his life. Ahmed Fouad al-Khatib, he is also from Gaza, living in the U.S. He's been out of Gaza for much longer than Hamza, but he is also an incredible, I think, potential leader. I don't think either of them are interested in being politicians right now, but I think these are the kinds of voices. There's also, I'm blanking on their names right now, but there are various similar peace-seeking activists in the West Bank. One of them, maybe you remember his name, he visited Yardena Schwartz shortly after he was released from captivity.
I don't remember his name, but it was a moving moment, obviously.
Yeah. And there's another one who often speaks alongside an Israeli peace activist whose parents were both killed on October 7th. He's a very prominent Israeli peace activist, and he often does kind of outreach alongside his Palestinian counterpart. Again, I'm blanking on his name.
It feels like those conversations we have about who would you want to run the United States, everybody who was so angry, both sides, and then you would ask them for a name, and it's like they come up with these names, but it's like some person no one's heard of, or who doesn't have the political clout, and it's always very aspirational, but it never feels like we're on the verge of finding the right name.
But that doesn't mean it can't be done. I mean, this idea that, it seems so hard, so we shouldn't do it. I mean, and maybe this sounds like a reach, but when people talk about this idea that it's never going to be possible to have peace between Israelis and Palestinians. I mean, think about Israel prior to the visit by Sadat before the the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. It sounded insane, the idea that Egypt and Israel would sign a peace treaty or that Anwar Sadat would come and visit Israel. And yet it happened within a very short time.
Or that Israel and the House of Saud would sign a peace treaty, you know, or
Right.
that Israelis would fly to Abu Dhabi, right? Miracles happen.
And on a similar note, this idea that you can't have, you know, a different kind of leadership within the Palestinian population or a re-education of Palestinian society to rid their education system of this radicalized, devotion to martyrdom or this rejection of
project, but it's doable.
It's doable. I mean, think about, and again, I'm not saying Palestinians are Nazis, but post-Nazi Europe, there was a complete re-education, de-radicalization. Japan, similar thing. And think about the US. I mean, 100 years ago, white and black Americans would not shake hands. You wouldn't, sit down in a train together. And look where we are today. I mean, societal transformation is possible, and I think we just have to believe in it.
Yardena Schwartz, thank you so much for joining us. I'll hold it up. Her book, Ghosts of a Holy War, it's really, I mean, you can just see from our conversation how thought-provoking and brilliant it is.
And it's way more optimistic than I made it out to be.
Thanks again, Yardena.
Thank you so much. This was such a pleasure.